Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to discuss COVID-19, the pandemic. What did we learn? Okay, so today our learning objectives are going to be we're going to describe the origin theories germane to the COVID-19 evolution, review the statistical data regarding the magnitude of COVID-19, and define the clinical management of patients with life-threatening COVID-19. And then finally, we'll end up describing the learning lessons achieved from COVID-19. But the idea of this presentation is to review the information that we were able to garner during the COVID-19 pandemic and then come up with some inferences of what did we learn regarding this pandemic so we can use this information for the continued treatment and the pandemic of COVID-19, which still exists today, but also for future pandemics, this can be helpful information. So we have really two main theories that exist on the origin of COVID-19. So the first one is that the COVID spilled from an animal into people, most likely in the wet market in Wuhan, China. So that is, we'll call this the zoological theory. And then the second theory is the virus actually came from the Wuhan Institution of Virology and spread due to some type of lab accident. Okay, there's no evidence in any theories at this point that this was an intentional, organized governmental attempt to try to introduce this virus into civilian population and societies to cause some kind of governmental control. There's not been no evidence of that. The two main theories is, did it come from an animal? And two, if it came from an animal, was that an animal in a laboratory setting which could have caused the leak? So we're going to talk about these two theories much more in detail. So the scientific belief in this is that really, as we're going to end up showing, is we don't really have a total consensus on exactly what happened. There's really no consensus on the origins of SARS-CoV-2. 4 out of our 8 intelligence agencies in the United States lean towards the natural origin for the view with a low confidence. Well, 2 of them, the Department of Education and the Bureau of the FBI, support a lab origin which having a moderate confidence about its conclusion. Now, virologists believe that the pandemic is less divided in U.S. intelligence, that these biologists really believe that there's very convincing data and overwhelming evidence that it came from an animal origin. And scientifically conclude that coronavirus most likely jumped from a caged wild animal into people at the Wuhan seafood wholesale market, where a huge COVID-19 outbreak, we call this ground zero, started in 2019. So the zoological theory believes that there's enough evidence to support it in the sense that there was photographic evidence of wild animals such as raccoon dogs, the red fox, which could be infected and shedded SARS-CoV-2 sitting in cages in the market. What's more is these cage animals are shown or near a stall where scientists found a lot of COVID, SARS-CoV-2 surfaces, including cages, carts, and machines that process animals after slaughter at the market. So there's evidence that says that these type of animals have been known to carry the coronavirus, for one. And two, a lot of these animals were in the wet markets of Wuhan, where there was a tremendous amount of people that were buying meat in those areas. And two, there was evidence of COVID viruses on surface that these animals had been in previously. So we do know that from a historical standpoint, coronavirus has been around for quite a while, and there's a belief that the horseshoe bat, okay, has been the instigator, where that's actually the origin of the coronavirus, and then this bat infects as an intermediate host, which we saw in MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, was the drama camel, and then we saw in SARS-1, okay, it was believed the COVID animal, and then in COVID-2, which was our COVID-19 pandemic, there was belief that the Patagonian was an animal. Now, that'll debate a little bit more, and we'll talk more about that. So the idea was that the horseshoe bat was the actual main carrier of this coronavirus, infected these different animals over the course of the last few decades, and these animals who live in close proximity or are available to the human at meat markets, etc., passed that to the human. So it wasn't the horseshoe bat right to the human, but it was the horseshoe bat to the Patagonian, to us as human beings. And these are some very telling pictures of these susceptible animals. So these are animals that we believe could have, carried this coronavirus to human beings, and they were held in stalls where COVID-2 was later detected on a machine that processed animals in the market. Now, we'll talk about this later. There's never been an animal found, however, in the wet markets that actually had this virus. So that'll be an argument that will be countered by the lab leak theory. And you can see these animals are in quite common proximity, close proximity to tons and tons of the Chinese in the Wuhan market, and they're very exposed. So if these animals were infected, it would be very easy that this infection would be transmitted to the population in the meat market. So, I mean, there's some evidence to support this type of transition. And if you look at in 2019, where the earliest 156 cases of COVID-19 were found in Wuhan, China, it shows that directly cases and then secondary cases center around near the market. So there's a lot of evidence that Wuhan market was the epicenter of the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So again, it leads to the belief that these animals could have been infected, which infected humans, which then transmit that infection throughout the near vicinity of other individuals in the area. One of the first animals that was kind of suspected was this thing called the Patagonian, which is very commonly captured and then later slaughtered for their scales are used in traditional medicine, and they seem to be one of the most suspected to be most trafficked mammal apart from humans, unfortunately, in the world. So these things are moved from one region in China to another region in China, and then parts are parts of the scales and the outside is used, and then the meat is taken to market to be utilized for food. So these things can move throughout the whole country because they are smuggled and they are transported for their value. The raccoon dog is also called the common raccoon, the Chinese or Asian raccoon dog, distinguished from the Japanese raccoon dog, is a small, heavyset fox-like canine native to Eastern Asia, and it's very related to the foxes. So this was another character, mammal that was thought to be possibly carrying the coronavirus, because these things often go into bat caves looking for bats to eat and stuff like that. So this was another suspected potential carrier of the virus as an intermediate host from the horseshoe bat. So the next one so these kind of lead to the belief that this could have been coming out of the, the theory that animal to intermediate animal to human beings. Now, the second one is the lab leak theory that the virus escaped accidentally. I want to stress that word. There's not been any discussion that it was intentionally leaked from the Wuhan Institution of Virology. And the belief is it may have been really specimens that were found in caves from the horseshoe bat in 2013, and I'll expand on that. So in 2013, okay, there was a case of these 6 miners, okay, who fell ill after they were were hired to clear caves of bat unum, which were bat drop-ins. Now, the reason they were doing this work with the bats was that during this time, China was in an agricultural revolution, and they were trying to improve their land and fertilize it, which had been decimated from years of poor farming techniques or pollution and erosion, things like that. So they had a lot of these miners going into caves and bringing this stuff out to help with agriculture. Well, it happened that 6 of these individuals that were in there developed severe respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, that looked very similar to the decade earlier of SARS. If you remember, SARS was around 2004, 2003, and it looked very similar. Unfortunately, 3 of the 6 miners went on to die of COVID-19 like pathophysiology, the same kind of pathophysiology we'd later see, about 10 years later with the COVID-19 pandemic. All right. So there was a belief that this was being kind of tested, examined, trying to assess, figure out what exactly was in his mind. And this was then transferred to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to investigate what exactly was in his bat that could have led to these miners' deaths. So this hypothesis is that the Wuhan Institution of Virology happens to be near the Wuhan meat market also, which makes things a little bit foggy and not so clear cut. It'd be different if it was all the way across the other part of China, but it's not. So the epicenter of the COVID-19 was also right by the Institution of Virology. And Qi Zheng'e, a renowned virologist in the lab, they recalled that a mysterious pneumonia was going through the city of Wuhan and wondering if this pathogen had escaped from her lab. And there had been reports that researchers at the Institute were performing gain and function experiments where natural viruses were being modified to become more virulent to better infect humans. So, there's some talk about there was some modification of these viruses also going on. And again, the argument with this is Chang also know that the Hannu seafood, which is again in Wuhan, and it's close to this virology, that no infected animal had been identified, and the Chinese researchers ruled out that the animals were origin of viruses. So you understand how this kind of gets fogged up, that there's really beliefs on both sides of these theories. Now, you have to wonder what was going on here, because this is a picture shortly after the outbreak of COVID-19. This is in January of 2020, and this is the Wuhan, and you can see nobody is getting past this, group of military fortified soldiers, is that nobody's getting in there to figure out anything. Okay, so that was totally blocked off, and nobody was allowed in there unless with special clearance. And you could see that before anybody could really get in there from the public, or some kind of other foreign scientists, like, people from different countries to evaluate what had happened. The whole area was disinfected and the whole area was totally sterilized. So this leads to, again, even Chinese scientists conceding that coronaviruses may have leaked from the Wuhan lab. So the World Health Organization, concludes that it's very unlikely that it leaked from virology, and they believe that it came from these animals. And the Wuhan researchers say they hadn't kept any live strains in the lab. And in their discussion with the investigation team, showing that similar viruses existed in China rather than in their lab. So again, they argued that everybody in their lab was safety tested and had psychological evaluations, that their physical and mental health were constantly monitored, and there was no way that anybody would intentionally or not perform the safety to let this virus leak. So again, this is contradictory information that argues what we just said in the slide previously. And as all this information came out after the initial information regarding the leak from the lab, there seemed to be a countermeasure put in by the Chinese government to say that that never happened. But the World Health Organization, very powerful organization in the world, agrees that they don't think it came from the lab. And this is what they argued. This was a safety type of protective equipment, PPE, that the researchers work, and it would be impossible for anything to leak or any of them being contaminated. And that does look pretty leak-proof to me. But again, this is after the fact. This was not before the fact. I don't know what they were wearing back in December of 2019. So the Oversight Committee of the U.S. government, they believe that this leaked. And I highlight some parts here that they say that with this organization, really they in 2021 looked at all the information, and they really believe that the origin of COVID came from a laboratory accident where a worker became ill, knowingly or not, and took the virus out to the community. So the lab leak is the only explanation that is credibly supported by our intelligence, by science, and common sense. And they argued that the spillover theory would be longer and overwhelming, while the spillover theory is nearly empty. So the oversight government, so these were individuals that are experts when it comes to infectious diseases. Their belief was that after doing much research, much gathering of the facts, they ended up coming up with, they believe that it was a lab leak, okay? But there's not really any evidence of COVID recirculating animals before the pandemic. Some experts said the inability to find an infected animal did not prove anything because China shut down the market and killed all animals before they could be tested. So again, researchers found striking that raccoon dog DNA came from a stall in human, but was also positive for COVID. So the argument is that, we will never know because the animals that were in the market were all slaughtered before they could be even tested to have COVID. So we don't know. We don't know what the animals were that were in there. But the raccoon dog, who still exists outside of the labs, obviously, or outside the markets, do have the same COVID virus that caused, COVID-19. So they're carrying it all the time. And this was the World Health Organization individuals that went to figure out what happened. And to be very honest with you, I don't really trust what they say, to be very honest, because they look all happy and they were wined and dined by China, and they're given the peace sign and stuff like that. So I don't know exactly how much true information they were able to gather, and exactly how they were placated in during this investigation. Now, the reason I put this picture in, like some of you may not remember this, but this is obviously J.F. Kennedy, and this is right before he gets assassinated. And what I put in there, why I put this in here is I was a young man at that time, a young boy. I was only in second grade, so I was only 8 years old. And to this day, we don't have a tentative answer on who killed JFK. And that's what my fear is with COVID-19. I've given you some data looking at the two main theories, but to be honest with you, I don't know if there's ever going to be a true answer to this problem. I really don't. It's just like who killed JFK? Every year around November 22nd, which was the day of his assassination, may he rest in peace. There are all kind of shows on rehashing it, but never does a show ever come with a conclusion. It's always with a theory. And that's what I'm afraid COVID-19. I may not see in my time because I'm almost 70, but somewhere maybe there will be truly the history of exactly what happened with this. So again, where did it come from? We may never know. We know these animals are susceptible. We know it happened in the market. It's killed 7 million people, and we just don't, we really don't know what the answer is. So the problem is Wuhan's laboratory and the market is only 27 kilometers from each another, which is not far, and it could have come from either place based on the epicenter. So next, I'm going to get into the magnitude of COVID-19. Globally, there's been 7 million people died across all ages. On an average, each person who died passed away 10 years younger than they would have had, which is, again, if you were, died when you were 40, you would have, lost 10 years. If you were died when you were 60, you would have maybe lived to 70. How many things do you imagine 10 millions of years of wiped away, of experiences that these individuals can never have? In the U.S., 80% of the deaths were over people of age of 65. Many of them had underlying medical conditions or disabilities, which increased the chance. So, obviously the older, more comorbidities had a higher death. It also seemed to kill blacks, Hispanics, and indigenous people who had less access to health care, who didn't maybe were educated on how to use proper PPE, proper infection control methods, and stuff like that. And today, there's an estimated 26 million people living in the United States with long COVID. So that's quite eye-opening and quite thought-provoking at just the magnitude on that slide. And you can see here, when you look at deaths per week in the United States, on how COVID just went from nowhere to being the major cause of death in the United States. Typically, heart disease is the major cause of it. And you look at regular flu and influenza, it hardly touches the population compared to COVID. You can see how big in 2020 that spike was, more than 15,000 deaths per week, secondary to COVID-19. So 1.1 million Americans died over 3 years. Again, the disease became the fourth leading cause of death after heart disease, cancer, unintentional death because of overdoses. So by the end of 2021, so it's not totally when COVID was totally over, the pandemic per se, Americans overall were dying 3 years sooner on average than they were, and the life expectancy dropped from 79 to 76, the largest decline in a century. So within those 3 years, it took away the life expectancy gains of 100 years. So it was historical drop in life expectancy. And according to the World Health Organization, globally, there were 336.8 million life years lost globally, not lives, but life years. And again, when you look at COVID-19, more deaths per day than the Civil War, which really was one of the bloodiest wars that America's ever been involved in. It was between our brothers. World War II, and you look at the different wars. So you look at, you think about World War II, there were about 200, 300 deaths per day, where there was over 1,000 deaths per day with COVID-19. So, and again, when you look at American deaths, unfortunately, the Civil War and World War II, now that's over a longer period of time than we looked at COVID. I mean, this data is, a year old, so maybe that's, caught up a little bit more. But again, it other than Civil War and World War II, it's never caused as many deaths as COVID-19 did. Third. And again, there was 104 million cases, 6 million related hospitalizations, and 1.1. So when you look at that 6 million hospitalizations, you're seeing 1/6, if my math is right, is about 17, 18%. So of those people who got hospitalized with COVID-19, especially early on in the pandemic, a lot of them ended up passing away. And this is as of May of this year, of 2023. So it's fairly recent. Now, I want to show you this. This is in Italy, and you can show how this wasn't just in the United States. You can see, you look at these two large metropolitan areas in Italy, and you can see how quickly the death rate, the number of deaths, go up, boom, in March of 2020 with the COVID pandemic. It's pretty much of a linear increase, and then all of a sudden here it becomes exponential increase of deaths. And Italy was one of the areas that was hit really, really hard early on with the pandemic because they were hit with a tidal wave. And I didn't realize this, that many Chinese people own properties in Italy because Italy doesn't really have an aged population. They have more of a younger population. A younger population. They have a lot of older people. So as the older people are dying off, there's a lot of land available that a lot of individuals from Asia, especially China, actually either use the areas for vacation areas, or they use the area for actual permanent residential areas. But I think that showed how quick and how deadly this virus was. And you look in the percent of population now. Again, we have such a large population, so it's hard to say in communications are better. And some argue that COVID did not make that much of a difference based on population, and it was blown out of proportion. When you compare it with the Black Plague, the plague of Justiniana, okay, and then you look at smallpox and you look at AIDS. AIDS, over the course of, 1981 to now, 30 million individuals, mostly males, have died of COVID. So again, the population didn't kill as much as some of these others, but remember the population is much larger today than it was during the Black Death. So again, this was as of May 31st this year. There's again over 767 million cases confirmed in the world, and almost close, it's probably well over 7 million deaths now. And there were over 13 trillion vaccine doses administered. And there's been 5 different major viruses: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Omicron. Now, we've had variations over the Omicron, the BXX and that stuff, but really there's 5 really major variants, because these newer ones are still kind of modeled after the Omicron variation and the Omicron RNA. And this slide shows you the different territories and that. And again, this is the gray bars, the world. This is United States and India, and then you can go down, you can look at all the numbers in different areas. But I'm going to argue the point that some of this information is not accurate, and you'll look at some of the countries like China, Soviet Union, Russia, that seem low, but I think those numbers are very lowly and under-recorded. So you have to keep these numbers somewhat in. So I don't think we really understand the true magnitude of COVID-19 because I don't think there's concrete, accurate record keeping. And two, there are individuals that may have died of COVID and ended up dying, actually was assessed of dying someone with something else. Okay, so these numbers are, I think they give you a good estimate, but I don't know how accurate they truly are. And again, you look at this time period, you look at April 20 and then all the way to September 22, and you can see the darkest COVID deaths under the age of 65. They've always been a lot less than the COVID, than the individuals over 65. But I want to bring you to this point. When the first booster was approved for people at 65, these two, this month, August and September of 21, almost was equal. Not quite. The elderly still died more, but you can see the difference the vaccine made because more elderly were being vaccinated than younger people for various reasons. And once you got the second booster and Omicron came, the deaths in general dropped dramatically at that point. And this one rise here in over age 65, one argues the majority of these individuals were individuals that decided not to get vaccinated, unfortunately. Now, that's the human toll, but there are other tolls too to look at. What the economists said that COVID-19 caused an economic shock that was 3 times worse than the financial crisis of 2008. That's when the stock market crashed and there were tremendous amount of a major recession. Europe and emerging markets have been economically hard. China had escaped the recession, although they're in the recession now. And the belief was that the worst was behind us and a greener economy could emerge after the pandemic, which in some areas it has and in other areas it hasn't. But it's had a tremendous effect on the GPN and a lot of people's economic. And this shows you how the real growth domestic product, how it was going to United Kingdom, United States in green, United Kingdom in the blue, Europe and you can see they were all doing fairly well. And then, wow, look at they dropped. Like United States dropped almost -12 in that area. I'm sorry, United Kingdom. United States was about -4, Japan. So you can see it had a huge impact, and it has improved. And afterwards, because of all the different government allocations, resources, incentives, but you can see it's kind of flattened out again as we go towards 2024. But you can see that was a significant drop in the GNP. So that gives you a magnitude, human and financial. So I want to talk about now what we learned about the clinical management of life-threatening. So obviously, this is what comes out is when we look at ventilator settings, you wanted to use low ventilator, lung protective, use a fair amount of PEEP, titrate oxygen to a SAT of 80 to 96, plateau less than 30. And these were some of the things that we learned, like doing prone positioning for at least 16 hours a day. And typically, this was some of the clinical management. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about that. So when we looked at ventilator settings, we kind of looked at provide low tidal volume, we call this ARDS net, assist control with tidal volumes no greater than 6 cc's per kilo of ideal body weight, and use PEEP 10 to 15 to start using some kind of objective data like PV tool, esophageal mammography if you do have that. SAT PO2 of 55 to 80, okay, 88 to 92 for most patients. And we actually even used lower. We were 85% for a lot of our patients. Maintain our plateau pressure, and again, titrate your PEEP FiO2 with either objective measurements like esophageal balloon, PV tools, or using the ARDS-net FIO2 PEEP guide, but some kind of systematic sequential titration. Prone positioning, we know, seemed to work very well during the pandemic. It was suggested that if you optimize the PEEP, if you optimize the lung protective ventilation and utilize things like paralytics, and the patient still had a refractory hypoxemia, or they met the ARDS criteria of moderate to severe PF ratio less than 150 for greater than 12 hours with an FiO2 greater than 60 and a PEEP of 8. They were advised to be in prone position 12 to 16 hours a day. Make sure you had an experienced staff. We had a great proning team. We used physical therapy, therapists to help us out, and they should be proned a minimum of 12 to 16 days. Typically, we saw improvements in 4 to 8 hours, but we continued to prone patients for 12, usually 16 hours, and then supine them for 8. And if they maintained their sat in for 4 hours consecutively in supine, then we thought about not proning them the next day. We also did prone patients prophylactically early on, 3 straight days, things like that. But one of the things we ran into too is how long do you prone patients? We had some patients that were very refractory to being supinated, and we proned them day after day until it was day 32, and we decided, we said, well, we can't keep on proning these patients forever. So what we did was we finally maximized our prone duration at 7 days. If patients are not, could not maintain supination after 7 days, then we would just leave them supine. We would not continue to prone them, because there's a plethora of problems associated with proning that's beyond this lecture here, and you just can't keep on having patients lay on their face day after day. So rescue therapy, so when prone failed, there was some talk about using recruitment maneuvers, although that would be using PEEPs of 40 centimeters for 40 seconds, maybe twice, and then every 4 hours. But that was shown not to improve outcomes and actually increase mortality. Some argued, increase your PEEP by increments of 2 until you got to like 2024. But again, I think that's better to do with objective measurements like compliance, PV tools, transpulmonary pressures. We used a lot of inhaled pulmonary vasodilator. We used inhaled nitric oxide. Sometimes we had to use inhaled Valentry or Flolan. This has shown not to improve outcomes, but this acts as a bridge sometimes until you can get other type of interventions on board. So sometimes if they fail prone and we were going to do VV ECMO, okay, which considered to be a last resort, we would use this as a bridge therapy to try to improve oxygenation until we could get them cannulated. And again, neuromuscular blockade using a gamut, different gamut of, paralytic agents really helped when patients had hypoxia associated with ventilator desynchrony. There was a lot of talk about PCILI, where patients injured their lungs by being totally asynchronous to ventilator. And then, as I said, VV ECMO is the last resort, but not everybody has ECMO available, so you have to keep that in mind. Initially, we were putting a lot of COVID-19 patients on ECMO, but we got very restrictive in the point that we were only doing our internal patients, and those patients were put on within 48 hours. We would not put it, and they had to be under the age of 45. So initially, we used ECMO very liberally, but after a while, we found that we had to really, really close our criteria. One, because we had only a finite amount of ECMO devices, and 2, ECMO being used in older populations or populations that had been on the vent for long periods of time did not have good outcomes at all. Our initial ECMO outcomes were less than 20%. After we closed the criteria, they were up over 50%. So again, there were some trials out there that said nitric oxide improved outcomes, but there was really reduction in mortality. And what we decided is what, as we use as a bridge, and if once we got them on that therapy, or if they did not respond to nitric right away, we discontinue it. Because I actually presented down the AARC last year on refractory hypoxemia by prolonged nitric oxide utilization. We used it on some patients for weeks, and then as we weaned it off, they abruptly desaturated, and they could not be weaned off for long periods of time, and a lot of the patients end up dying. So we kind of got ourselves in a do or die situation by leaving nitric on for weeks at a time. So again, the use of neuromuscular blockades to facilitate lung protective ventilation. Again, there is a significant improvement in outcomes. This was shown in JAMA in 2015 with the ARDS patients, and this was also re-emphasized and reproduced in COVID. If you had COVID patients that were asynchronous to ventilator, they had a high chance of mortality versus patients that were synchronized, because you could maintain lung ventilation, and you could also get better distribution of the inspired air. Oxygen delivery, it showed that compared to basic oxygen or conventional oxygen, that high flow oxygen was much better at preventing patients to get intubated that had a PF ratio less than 200. So high flow oxygen devices like Vapotherm or OptiFlow from Fisher-Paykel, they improved outcomes when you compare it to conventional oxygen strategies. And we saw that too. And the question that came up with, though, is how long you keep them on, and how long do you, when do you decide to intubate? Because we got into this area where we didn't want to intubate because patients were dying on the vent, but we left patients on high flow oxygen for weeks, and then when we intubated them, death was inevitable. I presented this also at the AARC conference and showed that almost 75% of the patients that we kept on high flow oxygen, we used OptiFlow, for greater than 7 days, who then went on to intubate, unfortunately died. So this has always been a black area. We don't know if we did the right things, but we were just doing what we thought was the best for the patients at the time. And it did say that when you compared it with non-invasive ventilation, a BiPAP, and non-invasive ventilation was basically not really something that was used early on in the pandemic because of fear of viral transmission with a mask that's leaking all over the place and a device that blows air at high liter flow. But when you did compare it, it did show the non-invasive group had a higher mortality than high flow nasal cannula. So again, high flow nasal cannula reduced the rate of intubation compared to non-invasive ventilation. So again, I would argue the point that, having high flow oxygen probably saved many lives that we'll never know of. And I don't know what we would have ever done if we didn't have that available during this pandemic. So it was very much a lifesaver. Now, there was a lot of talk about awake prone position in non-mechanically ventilated patients. We did this with a lot of our patients that were in high flow oxygen that were not intubated. We prone position them because we know prone position helps with mechanical ventilation. And there's a lot of data out there that looked at this. But there was really no conclusive duration. Some people argued that this worked, but the problem with looking at this data was there's no consistency of how long patients were prone and how well they were in prone positioning when they are non-ventilated. Because when you ventilate patients and you put them in prone, they're on paralytics and they're not moving out of prone, until you move them. Here, there were some patients that were in prone for 10 minutes. There were some patients that were prone for 4 hours. There were some patients that were prone for 12 hours. We don't know that. So the outcome data is somewhat fishy on this, about this. And they recommended against it because they really felt that these patients should be, if they needed to be prone and on high flow oxygen, they should be intubated at that point. They may have had some success, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But again, do we prone patients sometimes that are not intubated? Yes, we continue to do that because, again, if 50 patients, if out of 50 patients, if 2 get better, well, that's 2 that got better. That's 48 that didn't, but at least 2 got better. So we still do that at this point. PEEP, okay, it showed that patients that were given higher PEEP, and the actual PEEP that was interesting was around 13, 14 of PEEP was the average PEEP that was used in this patient population. One would argue this was the same PEEP that was shown in a lot of the ARDS studies, and some of the greatest minds said, I don't have to do measurements. Patients have severe ARDS. 13 of PEEP seems to be the mean average, and we should start with that. So again, it showed that the higher PEEPs patients did better than the lower PEEP. And again, our mean value of PEEP at our institution, where we ventilated about 1,000 patients with COVID, was about 14 of PEEP. We had as high as 24 of PEEP, and we had some people as low as 5 of PEEP. But our mean value and our medium was around 14 of PEEP. Patients that had asthma fared better than patients with COPD. COPD patients had 11% mortality rate that got COVID compared to 3% with asthmatics, which I felt great with because I have asthma, and I was very scared that I was going to get COVID and die because I had asthma. So ending up, what did we learn? So what did we learn from the pandemic? We do know that we have to use public health tracking, and it remains a constant vigilance, and it remains an ongoing public health challenge. So even though we don't talk about COVID today like we talked about it 2 years, 3 years ago, it's still going on. So we have to track hospital admissions. We have to track death certificates. I can tell you that since since April of this year, only 2 patients have died of COVID pneumonia in our institution. So that's very, very low. Emergency visits, if all of a sudden the ED doc's saying they're getting tons of patients in with COVID, that's a red flag. And then often doing genomic sequencing to look at new variances. Is there new stuff out there that we have to keep an eye at and be concerned that our vaccines are not going to work as well? So again, the U.S. Vaccine Administration has waned off tremendously. I know only 7% of the eligible COVID individuals that are eligible for COVID vaccines have got them as of November 2023. So we don't know what that's going to cause. There's a lot of skepticism regarding this. So you can see that we had very good initially booster, and it's waned off significantly. And when you look at immunity, it's believed that almost only 3.6 people who had blood drawn over the last, by 2022, showed that they didn't have some evidence of COVID immunity, either through antibodies from the vaccine, infection, or having both the infection and the vaccines. So you can see this green area up here. Okay, this is over the age of 16. Only a small percentage had no evidence of 3.6%. So you look at 26% of people never infected. They had the vaccine like myself. 22% have only been affected, and 50% had both the infection and the vaccine. So there's tremendous immunity out there. And that's why some people argue they don't need a vaccine, because there's already immunity, and they have the immunity because they've either had COVID or they've had previous vaccines. So again, this is what I'm saying, 96% of blood drawn, there's tremendous amount of immunity. And this came out in spring, that the next group of vaccines, which I did get the COVID vaccine back at middle of October of this year, should really only be focusing on the new variants, and the older vaccines should be disregarded. Okay, they're discarded and not used anymore because they are not effective against these new variants. No different than you would not give a flu shot from 2020 to somebody today because the flu variants are a little bit different. So again, they should only target, and they did, the new COVID vaccines target the Omicron XBB variants. COVID IC reaches zero for the first time. So in central New York, since 2020, okay, since October 2020, since May 30th, they had no COVID. First time they had no COVID patients in an ICU. And in the state of New York, there were 63 patients in ICU that still had COVID. Currently, we have no patients on the ventilator in our health system, Lehigh Valley Health Network. And so out of 50 ventilated patients, we don't have one single patient that's COVID on a ventilator. We do have one currently in the ICU. So I'm recording this on November of 2023. Okay, so we have very low COVID. And this just shows you this is in Nebraska. And one of the ways to actually figure out what are the variances around is to use wastewater, and you can see how the variants changed over time. So you can look at the lineage here. This was a Delta, then this became Omicron, and then this became BA2, and now you can see this is the XXB making up the largest percentage of the variants. So one of the surveillances they do is they look at wastewater, and the wastewater is a good indicator of what is the variant that is dominant in the area at that time period. Sewer data says that one person in Ohio had COVID for 2 years. They never shedded the virus, or they continued to shed the virus for 2 years in this sense. This person lived in Columbus. Now, were they symptomatic? Were they sick with COVID? No. It just says, they just seem to have COVID continuously. Some research shows that deer has spread COVID to humans multiple times, that actually deer got infected with COVID, and then individuals that are either hunt deer or end up being, raising deer, being around deer, end up getting COVID. So there's been 3 mutations that match the distinct period of the first spillovers of human to deer, then the spill back from deer to humans at this point. So again, they're found in our environments. I look out my solarium window, I see deer all the time. Okay, they're near our homes, pets, wastewater, and trash. So it looks like a spillover occurred, that we infected deer and deer reinfected us. There are tons of people that have what are known as long COVID. Okay, these are individuals that have motor slowing, low motivation, energy, short-term memory impairment, and this persists for months to year. The average is about 18 months, and this is considered to be inflammation of the brain. There are new strategies on how to treat these patients, because now it's better understood what is the cognitive problems with these. But some of these patients did not have severe. They had mild to moderate COVID and developed this what's considered to be neural inflammation of the brain, secondary COVID inflammation. 46% complain of brain fog. But now they're being treated like acute brain injury. For long COVID, who were previously in intensive care units, they may have undergone ventilation, hypoxic brain injury, lack of oxygen. So some of these people that have long COVID or brain cognitive could have been they had anoxic insults during the initial phase of COVID until they were intubated, and even while they're on ventilation, until they actually got optimized, they could have had pretty significant hypoxemia and then suffered brain injury from that. So the treatment for this brain fog is that we try to treat them as if they have a brain injury now. So we're not like, treating them as a distinct disease as much as this is a brain injury and we have to, deal with their brain functions just like we did with other brain injuries like Alzheimer's, dementia, and acute brain injuries. So unfortunately, these individuals, when they look at their brain functions and they look at their different types of, cognitive behaviors, it looks like some of these individuals aged a decade, that their brain functions are equivalent to what their brain functions should be if they were 10 years older. And many of them can no longer work, especially physicians. 60% of the physicians who develop long haulers says that they can't work anymore, so they can't do regular tasks. And 1 out of 5 of them, almost 20%, said they can't even work anymore. And only 33%. So physicians who took care of COVID patients and got COVID and they ended up getting this long COVID are no longer actually able to provide medical care because they have fatigue, headaches, muscular pain, nerve damage, joint pain, and respiratory sequela. It's really unfortunate. COVID could impair men's sperm for months, which means that individuals that try to get, trying to get pregnant, things like that, it takes longer than 3 months for sperm to swim, according to European researchers at this point. So again, not only do we have brain injury, but we also have, the ability to generate sperm at a reproductional number that will increase the chance of conception. And that's what I'm saying again. Post-COVID semen were down 20% in volume. They were down 27 in concentration. Count was down to 38, and number of live sperm was down to 5%. So that makes a big difference in, couples who want to, have a child or something like that. Some people that have a certain gene, the HLB gene version of this gene, they actually had COVID, but they never felt sick. So this gene seems to be something that we can look at as a potential way of either preventing or treating. So if you had COVID, but you never felt sick when you had it, you tested positive, you might be fortunate. They were 8.5 times more likely to have, to be asymptomatic. So again, we do know there were people that got COVID, they had no symptoms, people that got COVID that died. Well, maybe it was because of this gene. So this is something that's being looked at as a way of maybe being protective or being treative in the past, in the future. And again, there's a new variant that was out, but I haven't heard much about the EG5 variant at this point. The vaccine should be pretty protective from it. They did increase at one point. There was a spike at the middle of summer, but to be really true now, that spike seems to have dropped. So we'll have to see if we have increased cases in the late fall and winter, which is typical for respiratory viruses in general. So the lessons that we're learning, this is from the Yale medical community, and I'll finish up quickly with this. Masks are useful tools. Telehealth may become the new norm. Vaccines are powerful tools. Everyone is not treated equally, especially in a pandemic. As I mentioned, low economic groups especially did not have the same access to healthcare as some of the more affluent areas. We need to take mental health serious. There was a lot of mental health issues during the pandemic. There continues to be. We have the capacity to resist. We got through it, and we're stronger for it. And community is essential, and technology is too. And sometimes you need a dose of humility. And I remember when this hit our area, there were some pulmonologists, infections saying, this ain't gonna be a big deal. We'll be over this in a few weeks. and it was a few years before it was. So you have to be humble that sometimes the virus is going to kick your ass, and you need to be ready for that. So again, you know, if you maintain a mask, 6-foot distance, washing your hands frequently, and you stay at home and stayed away from people that were sick, you did well. Telehealth became very, very prominent. You didn't have to go out to see a doctor. You could use platforms like Zoom, WebEx, things like that. And more doctors were able to track people at home, and people were able to track their own blood pressures, sleep apnea, and even testing for colon cancer. I'm not going to get into this political issues with vaccines, but the evidence is real strong that shows that without vaccines, we'd had millions and millions of people die. Yes, vaccines do have some side effects, but the COVID-19 side effects has nothing compared to the actual illness of the vaccine. So the problem was, yes, I know vaccines can be problematic, but having COVID-19 we know is very problematic and caused millions and millions of deaths. We do have some issues with cardiac issues with the vaccines, but that doesn't cause millions of deaths like the virus did. As I said before, working mothers, people that that live in poor economic areas, they were not able to get the same health care. They were later to get the vaccines, etc. So not everyone's treated equally, as we always know. Mental health. Okay, the depression increased dramatically. These people have foggy minds from the long COVID we talked about. This continues to still be an issue where some people are afraid to leave their house. We got through it. I went back to the gym. I'm back at church. I do everything I did before the COVID. I just simply wash my hands much more. And if I'm around a lot of people, I might wear a mask at this point, or I like to do more things outside than inside. But 99% of my routine before the pandemic, I do today. And community was very, very important. Loneliness suppresses the immune system and is a precursor. So interacting with people, talking to your mail carrier, going to church, whatever, it is very essential that people continue to talk to each other and don't become isolated, because isolation itself is a death sentence, and can cause tremendous problems. And again, we learned on the fly. We made mistakes. We'll continue to make mistakes, but we have to realize that things are out of our control, and we try to do the best we can. So that's what I always said. In this pandemic, I saw a lot of people die, but we didn't kill people. We tried the best we could to help people survive. And unfortunately, sometimes that wasn't the best, and we learned on the fly, but we tried to do the best, and that's all you can ever ask from us as human beings. And we have to realize that we don't know everything, that we have to continue to learn, and we can't be egotistic believing, well, this is going to work, because it always worked. When you have this type of pandemic, you have to sit back and say, I don't know, I have to learn something new. This was through our healthcare network, and you can see the different pandemics, the different vaccines, and you can see that we're pretty flatlined now. We're doing very well as of February 23rd there. But yeah, we were on a roller coaster, and we had lots and lots of deaths, and we tried to do the best, and we got people vaccinated, and we used evidence-based medicine, but unfortunately, some people died despite our best efforts. And again, this was as of July 31st. You can see we ventilated 1,100 patients, 460 came off, 644 died, so that's a mortality of about 58%. Not grand, but, better than 100%. So again, we keep on trying to do our best at this point. So in conclusion, the origin of the virus remains a mystery. The magnitude of COVID-19 virus was enormous. We still have ramifications. COVID management of ICU was speared by evidence-based practices. As I said, we did what the evidence supported with severe ARDS patients. And the lessons learned from this pandemic will be far-reaching in magnitude and will help us hopefully in the future if we ever experience anything like this again. So, ending thoughts question at the end of the day, the only question I ask myself now after experiencing this pandemic, did I love enough? Did I laugh enough? Did I make a difference? Because I think we all learned from the pandemic that life is precious and we never know what's around the corner.